The night Nora Caldwell turned 18, the state of Kentucky handed her a manila envelope containing her birth certificate, a social security card, and $43 in cash. That was the sum of what the system believed she was owed. She stood outside the Harlan County Department for Community-Based Services on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, her entire life packed into a duffel bag that sat at her feet on the wet sidewalk. And she did not cry. She had learned long before that crying was a thing that happened when someone might see it and care. There was no one to see it. There was no one to care. She slept in her car for 11 nights. She parked under the lights at a truck stop off Route 9 because the lights made her feel less alone, even if they kept her awake. She ate from a vending machine and rationed what she had with the careful arithmetic of someone who had been doing the math of not enough for as long as she could remember. She was not looking for a miracle. She had stopped expecting those somewhere around the age of 12. Then a letter found her. It had been forwarded twice before it arrived at the DMV address she had listed as her residence, because a DMV address was the only address she had. It came from a lawyer's office in a town called Delwood. It named a woman called Ruth Alcott. It named Nora as the sole heir to a property on County Road 7. Nora read it 3 times in the parking lot under the truck stop lights. And the 4th time she read it, she remembered a kitchen that smelled like cornmeal and wood smoke, and a woman with dry hands who had braided her hair without being asked. Ruth Alcott had been dead for 6 weeks before anyone thought to find Nora. She had lived alone for decades in a small rural county where everybody knew her name and almost nobody knew her story. She had run a tavern. She had kept a ledger. She had pressed money into hands that needed it without writing it down anywhere that mattered, and she had done it quietly, the way people do things when they are not doing it for the credit. The tavern had been closed for years. The county had questions about taxes. A man in a clean jacket had already been asking around about the land. What Nora found when she pried up those old pine floorboards was not just what Ruth had hidden away in the dark below the joists. It was the record of a life spent in service to strangers, buried beneath decades of silence and sawdust, and a curtain left clean in a window that no one else had washed. Some people leave wills. Ruth Alcott left something harder to ignore, proof that a single quiet person, working alone, without recognition, can change the shape of an entire community. Nora had come looking for an inheritance. What she found was a reason to stay. The manila envelope was letter-sized and slightly damp at one corner, where it had been handled too many times. Inside it were 3 things: a birth certificate printed on green security paper, a social security card in a small paper sleeve, and $43 in bills that had passed through enough hands to feel soft as cloth. A woman behind a laminate desk had slid the envelope across to Nora Caldwell without meeting her eyes. She said good luck in the tone of someone reading from a script they had long since stopped believing. Nora picked up the envelope and her duffel bag in the same motion and walked out through the glass door into the October air. She was 18 years and 4 days old. The 4 days mattered to her, though she could not have said why. She had been counting toward this date for 3 years, the way a person counts toward something they are not sure they want to reach. The parking lot outside the Harlan County Department for Community-Based Services was half empty on a Tuesday afternoon. The painted lines faded to near nothing, a styrofoam cup rolling slow circles near the curb. Nora stood on the wet sidewalk and looked at the cup for a moment. Then she put the envelope in the outer pocket of her bag and walked to her car. The car was a 1994 Chevrolet Cavalier with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on the driver's side, only if you held the vent lever at a certain angle. She had bought it for $380 from a man in Pineville 6 weeks before her birthday, saving the money from a dishwashing job she had worked after school since the previous January. The odometer read 112,000 miles. One of the back windows would not go all the way up, and she had taped a piece of heavy plastic over the gap with silver duct tape, and the tape had held. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. She had nowhere to go. That was the plain fact of it, and she had known it was coming, and knowing had not made it smaller. The group home in Cumberland had been her last placement. She had aged out of the system on a Tuesday, which seemed like the wrong day for a thing like that, though she supposed there was no right day. She had a duffel bag, a car, a manila envelope with $43 in it, and a dishwashing job that paid her under the table 6 days a week at a diner on Route 9 near a truck stop called the Iron Wheel. She drove there now because it was the only direction she had. The Iron Wheel lot was lit by 4 tall sodium lamps that threw a yellow light over everything and hummed at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth. Nora parked at the far end of the lot, away from the trucks, and she slept there that first night with her jacket pulled over her shoulders and the seat reclined as far as it would go, which was not very far. The cold came up through the floor, and she woke several times. The last time she woke before dawn, she lay still and looked at the yellow light coming through the plastic-covered window and did not let herself think about much of anything. She worked the morning shift. She came in smelling of the car and changed into her work shirt in the single-stall bathroom near the kitchen, and nobody said anything. The diner owner, a man named Curtis Blevins, was not a kind man, but he was a consistent one. And consistency was something Nora had learned to value above almost everything else. He paid her at the end of each shift in cash, folded once, slid across the pass-through shelf without a word. She ate a meal there each day as part of the arrangement. She was careful with what she spent. 11 nights she slept in the Cavalier in the Iron Wheel lot. She washed her face in the diner bathroom each morning and kept her work clothes clean and folded in the bag and did not miss a shift. On the 9th night, it rained hard enough to drum on the roof of the car, and she lay listening to it and thought that there were worse sounds. On the 11th night, she woke at 2 in the morning to a sound outside and sat up fast before she understood it was only a truck backing to the diesel pump. Her heart slowed. She sat in the dark and pressed both hands flat on the steering wheel until she felt steady. The letter arrived on the morning of the 12th day. She had given the DMV her address as the Iron Wheel Diner on Route 9, listing it as a business address, which the form allowed. The diner received mail in a metal box on the post near the road. Curtis Blevins set the letter on the pass-through shelf when she came in for her shift, not saying anything, just setting it there. It had been forwarded twice. The first forwarding address was the group home in Cumberland. The second was a county social services address she did not recognize. Her name was typed on the front in the clean serif font of a professional letterhead. She opened it during her break, sitting on the concrete step outside the kitchen door, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. The letterhead read, Gerald W. Foss, Attorney at Law, Delwood, Kentucky. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. It informed her that a woman named Ruth Eleanor Alcott of Delwood had died on September the 14th at the age of 81 and had named Nora Jean Caldwell as the sole beneficiary of her estate, which included a parcel of land and the structure upon it at 1240 County Road 7, Delwood. It asked her to contact the office at her earliest convenience to arrange transfer of the deed and the key. Nora read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, tracking each sentence with her finger, the way she had learned to do in school when something mattered. Ruth Eleanor Alcott. She said the name quietly, just the sound of it in the cold morning air behind the diner. Something moved in her memory, distant and soft-edged, the way memories are when you were very young. A kitchen with a low ceiling, cornmeal smell. 2 dry hands separating her hair into sections without hurrying. She had been 4, maybe 5. The memory lasted only a moment before it went blurry at the edges the way those early ones always did. She sat on the step for a long time after that. The coffee went fully cold. A cook came out to dump a bin of vegetable peelings and glanced at her and went back inside. Nora folded the letter back into thirds along its original creases and slid it into the envelope and put the envelope in the breast pocket of her work shirt against her sternum. She pressed the flat of her hand over it once. Then she stood up, picked up the cup, and went back inside to finish her shift. She called Gerald Foss from the payphone outside the Iron Wheel the following morning, feeding quarters in until the line connected. His voice was older than she had expected, measured and unhurried, the kind of voice that had delivered difficult news enough times to have learned how to carry it without dropping it. He confirmed what the letter said. He told her there were no liens on the property beyond a small outstanding balance of county taxes that amounted to $411, which the estate could cover. He asked when she could come. She told him she could come Thursday. He said Thursday was fine. Delwood was 83 miles north of Harlan, which on a map looked like nothing, and on Route 9 felt like a different century. Nora drove up on a gray Thursday morning with the heater holding the cab at just above cold and the plastic-covered window humming at highway speed. The road climbed out of the valley and ran along ridge lines where the trees had already given up most of their color, the oaks holding their rust-brown leaves like they were not ready to let go. She passed through 2 towns small enough that she could see the end of each one before she reached the middle. She passed a grain elevator with a hand-lettered sign and a church with a marquee that had been missing several letters long enough for the gaps to feel permanent. Gerald Foss kept his office in a 2-story brick building on Delwood's main street, which was also the only street with parallel parking. The office was up a flight of wooden stairs that creaked on every step, and the landing at the top smelled of old paper and forced air heat. A woman at a front desk told Nora to go on in, gesturing with a pen toward a door that was already open. Foss was standing when she entered, which she noticed because most people did not bother. He was in his middle 70s, lean, wearing a wool vest over a dress shirt, and he shook her hand with both of his, the way people do when they mean it. He told her what he knew about Ruth Alcott, which was less than Nora expected, and more than she had. Ruth had been born in Delwood in 1942 and had lived within 12 miles of her birthplace for her entire life. She had inherited the tavern from her father, a man named Horace Alcott, who had run it from the end of Prohibition until his death in 1971. Ruth had kept it open another 22 years, closing it in the early 90s when the road that fed most of its traffic was rerouted 3 miles east to accommodate a new county bypass. After that, she had lived alone in the back rooms of the building, growing a kitchen garden and keeping largely to herself, though Foss paused here and said that keeping to herself was perhaps not entirely accurate. He slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. It was a deed, clean and clear, with Nora's full name typed in the grantee line. Beside it, he set a key on a short brass ring. The key was old, flat-bladed, the kind cut for a mortise lock, worn bright at the bow where a hand had held it for decades. He told her the property was at 1240 County Road 7, 4 miles past the junction with Route 9. He told her the building had not been occupied in a residential sense for approximately 3 years, since Ruth had moved to a care facility in Barberville, though a neighbor had checked on it periodically. He told her it would need work. He said it with a lawyer's neutrality, which meant it needed a great deal of work. Nora asked him how Ruth had known where to find her. Foss folded his hands on the desk. He said Ruth had been asking about her for some time, off and on, through a social services contact in Harlan, whose name he did not have. He said Ruth had tracked her through several placements over the years, though she had never made contact directly. He said he did not know why Ruth had not made contact. He paused in the careful way of someone choosing not to speculate out loud. Nora looked at the key on the desk and did not say anything. She remembered, sitting in that office, a fragment she had not thought about in years. She had been 4 years old, in a county car, looking out the back window at a porch. A woman standing on the porch, not waving, just standing, her hands at her sides. The image lasted no longer than a slow blink, and then it was gone again. She had spent so much of her life not examining those early fragments too closely, the way you learn not to press on a bruise. She took the deed and the key, and thanked Foss, who stood again when she stood, and walked her to the top of the stairs. County Road 7 turned off Route 9 at a junction marked by a stop sign with a bullet hole in it, which was not unusual in that part of the county. The first mile was paved, cracked along the center line, grass growing in the fissures. Then the pavement ended and the road became packed gravel. And then the gravel thinned and gave way to 2 dirt tracks with a grass spine between them, and the trees on either side grew close enough that bare branches touched overhead. The world closed in the way it does on roads that are not meant to carry strangers. Nora drove at a walking pace and watched her odometer. At 4.3 miles, she found the number 1240 on a rural mailbox that had rusted through at the post and been wired to a fence stake to keep it upright. She turned in on a gravel drive that crunched under the tires and curved through a stand of cedar. Then the trees opened and she stopped the car and sat looking at what Ruth Alcott had left her. The building was long and low, built of board and batten darkened by decades of weather, a covered porch running the full width of the front. The porch roof had collapsed at the left end, pulling the gutter with it. The sign above the door was faded to near illegibility, but if you looked at the right angle in the gray morning light, you could still make out 2 words: Alcott's Tavern. Nora sat in the car a moment longer. Then she got out. She walked the perimeter before she went inside, the way her second foster father had taught her to do with any structure before you committed your weight to it. The foundation was poured concrete, intact. The rear wall had a section of soft board near grade that she pressed with her thumb and did not like the feel of, but the rest was solid. The roof over the main body looked sound, the tin showing rust at the seams but no obvious failure. She came back around to the front and stopped at the porch steps. She looked up at the building, at the collapsed section and the weeds between the boards and the wasp nests in the corners of the soffit. Then she looked at the back window, the one on the right side of the door. She looked at it for a long time. The glass was clean, and behind it hung a curtain, white with a small blue check, freshly washed and pressed, hanging straight. The mortise key turned hard in the lock, grinding against decades of disuse, and Nora had to lean into it with the heel of her hand before the bolt drew back with a sound like a single knock on wood. The door swung inward on hinges that had stiffened but held, and the air that came out was cold and close, the kind of cold that is not weather but time, the smell of a room that has been sealed against the world long enough to develop its own atmosphere. Dust. Old grain, something beneath that, faint and warm, like the ghost of wood smoke absorbed so deep into the walls it had become structural. Nora stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The main room was long, running the full depth of the building from front to back. To her left, the bar ran the length of the wall, a solid piece of work in dark-stained oak with a brass footrail that had gone green at the fittings. Behind it, shelves rose to the ceiling, and on the shelves the bottles were still standing. Not many, perhaps 24, but upright and in order, their labels faded to pastel. Bourbon, rye, a few unlabeled dark bottles that might have been anything. Someone had wrapped the necks in cloth before they left, the way you would if you intended to come back. Nora looked at the cloth on the bottles for a moment, then she stepped inside. The floorboards were wide-cut pine, old growth, each board nearly 14 inches across and worn smooth at the center of the traffic paths. They creaked under her with a deep, resonant sound that was more voice than complaint. Tables were still arranged along the right side wall, 4 of them, each with its chairs turned up, and seated on the tabletop the way a diner would do it at closing. The chair legs pointed at the ceiling like something waiting. Between the tables and the bar, the open floor space ran clear, 12 feet wide, enough for people to move through each other without trouble. A potbelly stove sat in the far right corner, its flue pipe disappearing into a collar in the ceiling, a small bucket of ash still sitting beside it with a handled ash rake leaning against the wall. Nora moved slowly, stepping where the boards looked most solid, testing her weight at each step before committing it. The construction was sound in a way that newer buildings were not, each board face-nailed with cut nails that had held their grip for decades beyond what a modern wire nail would have managed. The subfloor beneath was tight, no give, no lateral movement when she pressed down hard at the center of a span. She had grown up in enough old houses to know the difference between a building that was failing and one that was simply resting. This one was resting. The bones were good. At the far end of the bar, a door stood half open onto a back room that would have been the kitchen. She went through and found a commercial range, a 6-burner Garland unit from the look of it, its cast iron grates orange with surface rust, but the body intact. A deep 3-compartment sink lined the back wall, the kind used for washing volume. Hanging pots and pans on iron S-hooks from an overhead rack, a few missing but most still there, their copper and cast iron surfaces filmed with the gray of long air exposure. The kitchen had a door to the outside, a heavy one with a drop bar, and beside it a window that had been left cracked a 1/4 inch, which explained why the kitchen air was less sealed than the main room. It also explained, Nora thought, how a curtain could stay clean while everything else gathered dust. She went back through to the main room and stood behind the bar. The duckboards beneath her feet were solid. Under the bar counter, the shelving was full. Bar towels folded and stacked in a wire rack. A mechanical ice crusher bolted to the counter edge. A Hobart glass washing brush still seated in its basin, rubber seal intact. None of it spoke of abandonment in a hurry. It spoke of someone who had closed a place correctly, who had put everything in its order before leaving, who had imagined someone else arriving later and finding things right. Nora ran one hand along the underside of the bar shelf, and her fingers came away with only light dust. She was standing still, not thinking about anything in particular when she felt it. She had shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, a small, unconscious movement, and the board beneath her right heel had moved differently than the ones before it. Not a creak, not the soft give of rot. A hollow sound, brief and low, like a knuckle tapped against a wall to find the stud. She stepped back. She stepped forward again, right heel first. There it was. She moved 12 inches to the left and repeated the motion. The sound was solid, normal. She moved back to the first spot. Hollow. She crouched down and looked at the floor. The boards here were the same width as the rest, the same color, the same pattern of face nails at regular intervals. But when she looked at the cut lines between boards, one section, roughly 3 feet by 2, had gaps that ran cleaner than the rest, the edges not fused with the compression of decades the way the surrounding boards were. She pressed down along one edge with her thumb. The board moved just slightly, less than a 1/16 of an inch, but it moved. She pressed the adjacent board. Nothing. She sat back on her heels and looked at the section of floor and put both hands on her knees and was quiet for a moment. She did not try to open it then. She had no tools, and she had already learned enough in her life to know that forcing something without the right equipment usually broke the thing you needed to keep whole. Instead, she stood, walked to each window in the main room, and looked out in turn. The cedar stand she had come through, the collapsed porch section, the overgrown track that ran behind the building toward a low outbuilding she had not explored yet, its roof intact, its doors chained. She looked at all of it with the attention she brought to things that might matter. When she came back to the bar, she stood at the spot again and pressed her heel down once more, listening. The hollow sound came back, quiet and certain, like a question that already knew its answer. Nora looked up at the bottles behind the bar, the cloth-wrapped necks, the careful order of them. She looked at the chairs on the tables with their legs pointing at the ceiling. She looked at the curtain she could see through the interior window, white with a small blue check, hanging perfectly straight in a building no one had entered in 3 years. Ruth Alcott had closed this place correctly. She had put everything in its order, and beneath the floor behind the bar, something had been placed in its order too, and left there, and waited. Delwood had one hardware store, a narrow building on the east end of the main street called Greer's Supply. Its sign painted directly onto the brick in letters that had been retouched often enough to show 3 generations of paint beneath the current coat. A bell above the door rang when Nora pushed through, and the smell inside was turpentine and machine oil and the particular dryness of stored lumber, a smell she had always found steadying. The store ran deep, its shelving packed with the organized density of a place that had been adding inventory for 50 years without removing much. A man was standing at the back counter reading something laid flat, and he looked up when the bell rang. His name was Walt Greer, and he was the kind of man who looked like he had been built for exactly the environment he occupied. He was in his mid-60s, broad through the shoulders, with hands that carried the permanent discoloration of someone who worked with metal and wood daily and had long since stopped trying to get entirely clean. He asked what she needed without preamble, which Nora appreciated. She told him she was working on the Alcott property and needed to lift some old pine boards without splitting them. He looked at her for a moment, not assessing, just listening. And then he turned and walked down one of the side aisles without asking her to follow, which meant she should follow. He came back with a 30-inch wrecking bar, the kind with a flat chisel end and a curved crow end, its steel surface worn silver at the working edges from long use. He set it on the counter. Then, without being asked, he went back and returned with a 5-in-1 painter's tool and a short-handled mallet. He laid them beside the bar. He said the painter's tool would let her work the joint before she committed the bar, which would save the boards if the wood was still sound. He said old-growth pine was worth keeping. Nora reached into her jacket pocket and held out $9, which was what she had estimated tools like these would rent for by the day. Walt Greer looked at the $9 and then looked at her and said to bring them back when she was done. He did not take the money. Nora held the bills a moment longer, then put them back in her pocket. She was back at the tavern by 10 in the morning with the tools and a trouble light she had found in the Cavalier's trunk, its cord long enough to reach the outlet she had tested inside, which still had power from the county line. The outlet was an old 2-prong ungrounded type, the kind that preceded GFCI requirements by several decades, but it held the load. She ran the cord under the bar and hung the light from the brass footrail above the section of floor, which threw a clean working light across the boards. Then she crouched down and started with the painter's tool, working it into the gap along the straightest edge of the section, tapping it with the mallet in short, controlled strokes, feeling for the give that would tell her the board was freeing from the subfloor. The pine was hard. Old-growth heartwood dried for decades does not move easily, and whoever had cut this section had done it carefully, the gaps tight enough that the painter's tool had to find its angle before it would seat. She worked the first edge for 20 minutes before she felt the board shift. Then she moved to the adjacent edge and worked it the same way, patient, tapping, resetting, tapping again. Sweat came up on the back of her neck despite the cold in the building. Her knees ached from the crouch. She shifted to kneeling and kept going. When all 4 edges of the section had given enough to show daylight beneath them, she set down the painter's tool and picked up the wrecking bar. She seated the flat chisel end into the best gap, the one with the most clearance, and pressed down slow and even on the curved end, using her body weight rather than muscle so the force stayed controlled. The board groaned. A low, woody sound of compression releasing, then a dry crack as the first nail pulled. She held the pressure. Another nail pulled, and then two more in rapid succession, and the board lifted a half-inch and held there. She moved the bar to the next position and repeated it. Then the third. She worked her way around the perimeter of the section until all four boards that formed it had their nails drawn, and then she set the bar aside and lifted the section by hand. The cavity beneath was dark, roughly 24 inches deep, its walls and floor lined with dry sand that had been poured in and leveled. Sand was an old insulator and a desiccant both, and whoever had prepared this space had known what they were doing. The trouble light did not reach well into it, and Nora tilted it down by its cord. In the center of the sand, sitting level and stable, was a tin strongbox, olive green, approximately 12 inches by 8, with a hinged lid and a simple latch. Its surface was clean. Not wiped clean, but protected clean, the sand having kept the moisture away from the metal well enough that only the corners showed any oxidation at all. Nora looked at it for a moment without touching it. She reached in with both hands and lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the bar top and stood up straight and pressed both hands against the small of her back and breathed. The latch was a simple draw-bolt type, no lock, and it moved without resistance when she pressed it with her thumb. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined with a single layer of oilcloth, yellowed but intact, and on it were three things laid in order. A roll of bills bound with a rubber band that had dried and cracked but still held. A cloth-covered ledger, small, the size of a personal journal, its spine intact. And an envelope, letter-sized, unsealed at one end, with 3 words written on the front in a steady, unhurried hand. For Nora. When she is ready. Nora picked up the roll of bills first, because that was the practical thing to do. She slid the rubber band off carefully and counted the bills on the bar top, smoothing each one flat. 20s, 10s, a few 5s, laid in order by denomination the way a careful person keeps money. The total came to $2,200. She stacked the bills and set them to one side. Then she picked up the ledger and opened it to the first page, which was dated January the 3rd, 1978, the year written in full in the same steady hand as the envelope. She read the first entry, and then the second, and then she turned several pages and read more. She did not pick up the envelope. She set the ledger down on the bar beside the bills and stood quietly for a long while, one hand resting flat on its cloth cover, and did not reach for it. The ledger was bound in brown cloth that had softened with handling until it felt more like worn canvas than book cover. The spine was hand-stitched with heavy linen thread, tight and even, the kind of binding a person does themselves when they want a thing to last. Nora opened it again to the first page, and this time she read slowly, the way she had read the lawyer's letter in the truck stop parking lot, tracking with her finger, giving each line its full weight. The first entry was dated January the 3rd, 1978. It read, Harlan Combs, $11. Cole Road accident, wife and 3 children. Below it, in smaller letters, no repayment expected. That last phrase appeared on every page. No repayment expected. Not as a printed header or a rubber stamp, but written out by hand each time, in Ruth's steady script, as though she needed to state it fresh with each entry, so there would be no ambiguity later, no room for anyone to read it differently than she intended. The ledger ran from 1978 to 2009. 31 years of entries in the same hand, the ink color shifting over the decades from blue-black to blue to the lighter blue of a pen running low and being used to the last. There were 243 entries. Nora counted them standing at the bar, turning pages slowly, her finger moving down each column. The amounts were never large. $11 to the Combs family, $34 to a boy named Clifton Pruitt in September of 1994, listed as school supplies and winter coat. $18 to Gerald Foss in March of 1991, listed only as truck repair. $22 to a woman named Dora Sizemore in July of 1985, listed as groceries July 4th week. The largest single entry was $211 given in February of 2003 to a family named Tackett, listed as heating oil, February cold snap. The smallest was $3.50, given to someone listed only as the Renfro boy, for a bus ticket dated June of 1988. Nora read that entry twice. She turned to the middle of the ledger and read a stretch of entries from the mid-90s, the years after the bypass had rerouted the road and the tavern had closed. The entries did not stop when the tavern closed. They continued at the same pace, one every few weeks on average, sometimes 2 in a month, occasionally a gap of 6 or 7 weeks followed by 2 entries on the same date. The money did not come from a business anymore after 1993, but it kept coming. Nora looked up from the ledger and looked at the shelves behind the bar, the cloth-wrapped bottles, the Hobart brush in its basin. She thought about what it cost to keep giving when the income that had made the giving possible was gone. Some names appeared more than once. The Combs family had 4 entries across 15 years, each one at a different kind of crisis. The first the Cole Road accident, then a medical bill, then a note that read simply, "Eldest daughter, first semester, $47. The last Combs entry was from 2001, and it was different from the others. The amount column read 0. In the description column, Ruth had written, Harlan Combs repaid in full, his own choosing. Refused to accept return. Nora stared at that entry for a long time. Ruth had recorded the refusal. She had kept track of the fact that someone had tried to give back and that she had not let them. The names were not all local. There were a few from Barberville, 1 from Pineville, 2 from a place listed only as over the ridge, which could have meant anywhere. But most were from the immediate area, the small communities strung along County Road 7 and the roads that fed it, places with names like Stony Fork and Kildav Hollow and Martin's Branch. Nora recognized none of the family names except one. Partway through the 1980s section, in an entry dated October the 9th, 1986, she found a name that stopped her. The entry read, Caldwell girl, placed with state, 4 years old. Bus fare for the caseworker who drove her, $9. Nora stood very still. She read the entry again. The caseworker who drove her, $9. She was 4 years old in October of 1986. She did the arithmetic without wanting to, and it came out the same way twice. Ruth had recorded the day Nora left. She had recorded it in the same ledger, in the same hand, under the same heading as every other act of practical help she had ever performed. No repayment expected. Nora closed the ledger and set both hands flat on the cover and looked at the wall behind the bar. The bottles stood in their careful order. The afternoon light had moved and was coming through the side window now at a low angle, laying a bar of pale gold across the bar top, just to the left of where her hands rested. She did not open the envelope. She had been aware of it the entire time, sitting at the edge of the bar where she had set it when she first opened the strongbox. Its flap folded back, her name in Ruth's hand facing up. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a door you are not yet ready to go through. She picked it up once and turned it over and set it back down. Then she pulled one of the bar stools around to the customer side and sat down and set the ledger on the stool beside her and looked at the envelope from that angle instead. The afternoon got quieter. The building settled around her in the way old buildings do as the temperature drops, small ticks and creaks, the tin roof contracting in the cooling air. A branch somewhere outside moved against the siding with a dry, rhythmic sound. Nora sat at the bar of the Alcott Tavern with the ledger and the $2,200 and the unopened envelope. And she was quiet for a long time, in the way a person is quiet when they are not resting, but thinking. when they are trying to make room inside themselves for something that is larger than they expected it to be. The light through the side window moved, and then went flat as the cloud cover thickened, and the room went gray and even and still. She sat in it. She did not reach for the envelope. Not yet. She opened it the next morning. She had slept in the car again, parked in the cedar stand at the edge of the property, and she had woken before light and sat watching the building take shape out of the dark as the sky behind the ridgeline went from black to gray to the flat white of an overcast dawn. She had the envelope on the dashboard in front of her. She had put it there the night before, so it would be the first thing she saw. She drank the last of a bottle of water and got out of the car and went inside and stood behind the bar in the cold morning air and picked up the envelope and opened it. The letter was 3 pages, written front and back on ruled paper in Ruth's hand. The same hand as the ledger, but slower, more deliberate, as though she had drafted it more than once before arriving at this version. It was dated March the 3rd of the year she died. Nora smoothed the pages on the bar top, one at a time, and read, "Dear Nora, I am writing this in the back room of the care facility in Barberville, which is a decent enough place but not mine, and at 81 years old I have become particular about what is mine and what is not. I am going to tell you some things plainly because I have found that plain is kinder than careful when there is not much time left. You came to me in November of 1986 when you were 4 years old, and your mother had been taken to the county hospital, and there was no one else. I had done short-term placements before, 3 or 4 over the years, and I knew how to do it without getting attached. I did not manage that with you. You were a quiet child, not sad quiet, but watchful quiet, the kind of child who learns a room before they decide to be in it. You used to sit on the stool at the end of the bar after closing and watch me wipe down the counter, and you never asked for anything. And I should have understood sooner what that meant about how you had been taught to expect the world to behave. You were with me for 11 months. In October of the following year, the state determined that a different placement was more suitable, which was the language they used, and I did not have the standing to object, not being a licensed foster home in the formal sense. I drove you to the county office on a Tuesday. You did not cry. I want you to know that I did, after, in the car, which is something I have never told anyone and am only telling you now because it seems relevant. I looked for you after that, not continuously and not always with the result I hoped for, but I looked. I had a contact at the Harlan office who would tell me, when I asked in broad terms, how things stood. She told me enough for me to understand that things were not always easy for you, and I want you to know that I am sorry for every year of that. I did not come to you directly, and I have sat with the reason for that for a long time. The truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that appearing after so many years would disrupt whatever stability you had built. And I was afraid, if I am honest, that you would not remember me, or that what you remembered would not be something you wanted returned to you. That was a cowardly calculation, and I know it. What I can tell you is what I have left you, and why. The tavern is yours free and clear. The deed is with Gerald Foss, who is a good man and has been my lawyer for 40 years and will not steer you wrong. There are taxes outstanding of $411, which the cash in the strongbox will more than cover. The strongbox you have already found, since you are reading this, or else someone else has found it, in which case I have badly misjudged the situation. I am trusting it is you. The $2,200 in the box is for immediate use, whatever you need it for. Do not be careful with it. It is meant to be used. Behind the kitchen, behind the beadboard panel on the north wall, the one that sounds different when you knock on it, there is a second room. In that room there is a fireproof lockbox, gray, with a 3-digit combination that is the address of this building. 124. Inside it you will find $14,000 in mixed bills and the original deed to the property with the survey markers. There is also a crate of documents that Gerald will help you understand. I am not leaving you these things because I feel I owe you a debt, though perhaps I do. I am leaving them to you because you are the person I would most want to have them, and at my age that is the only criterion that makes sense. The tavern needs work, but the bones are good. I kept the tin roof patched and the foundation dry and the back window curtain clean because I believed someone would come, and I wanted them to find it ready. I do not know what you will do with the place. That is not my business. But I will tell you that the happiest years of my life were the years I ran it, not because of the business, but because of what a place like that permits, which is the daily company of people who need somewhere to be. There are always people who need somewhere to be. I found that to be the most useful thing I could offer, and I offered it as long as I was able. There is one more thing. In the ledger, you will find an entry from October of 1986. $9 for the caseworker's bus fare. I put it in the ledger because I put everything in the ledger, and because I wanted a record that you had been here, that you had passed through this place and left a mark on it, even if you were too young to know it. You were here. That has always mattered to me. I hope you are well. I hope the world has been kinder to you than it sometimes is. I hope you find, wherever you land, that somebody left the curtain clean. Yours, Ruth Eleanor Alcott. March the 3rd. Nora read the letter through once without stopping. Then she set the last page down on the bar and stood with both hands pressed flat on either side of it and looked at the ruled lines of Ruth's handwriting without reading the words again. She stood like that for a long time. The building was quiet around her. At some point she became aware that she was wiping her face on the back of her hand, and she let herself do it, and then she was still again. She folded the 3 pages back in the order they had come, running her thumbnail along each crease to make it sharp and clean. She slid them into the envelope. She pressed the envelope flat against the bar top with one hand. Outside, the overcast had begun to break at the eastern ridge, and a line of pale light was working its way across the floor toward her feet. 3 days after she read the letter, Nora was on her knees in the tavern kitchen pulling the rusted grates off the garland range and stacking them against the wall when she heard a car on the gravel drive. It was not a sound she had heard since arriving, the property being far enough off County Road 7 that casual traffic did not find it. She set the last grate down and wiped her hands on the thighs of her jeans and walked through to the main room. Through the front window, she saw a late-model sedan, dark blue, parked beside her Cavalier with the careful spacing of someone accustomed to parking in lots that had lines. The man who got out was in his mid-50s, dressed in a wool overcoat the color of charcoal, unhurried in his movements. He had the particular ease of someone who had learned a long time ago that being calm in an encounter gave you the advantage in it. He looked at the building for a moment before he looked toward the door, and his expression as he looked at it was neither admiring nor dismissive, but assessing, the way a person looks at something they have already decided the value of and are now confirming. He came up the porch steps carefully, testing each one, and knocked twice on the door frame since the door itself stood open. Nora did not move from where she stood behind the bar. She said, "Come in," and he did, stepping through the doorway and pausing to let his eyes adjust. He introduced himself as Dennis Holt, gave her a card from the breast pocket of his coat without ceremony. The card read, "Holt Property Development," with a Lexington address and a phone number. He said he had heard through Gerald Foss' office that the property had transferred, and that he wanted to introduce himself before too much time passed. He said it the way you say something that is true, but is not the whole truth. He looked around the main room with the same assessing expression he had used on the exterior. He looked at the bar, the shelving, the potbelly stove, the chairs still turned up on the tables. He did not comment on any of it, which told Nora more than a comment would have. A person who comments is reacting. A person who only looks has already moved past reaction to calculation. She set his card on the bar and left both hands resting on the counter and waited. He turned back to her after a moment and said he had an offer to make, if she was willing to hear it. The offer was $61,400 for the parcel, as described in the deed. Structures included as-is condition, with a 30-day close, and Holt's office covering the transfer costs. He said $61,400, as though the specificity of the number was itself a demonstration of seriousness, of research already done, of a price arrived at by method rather than invention. He said he understood the property had come to her unexpectedly, that she might want time to consider, but that the offer had a natural window since his financing for the project was committed to a timeline. He said the phrase natural window with a quietness that made it sound like information and not a warning, though it was both. Nora looked at him. He was not a dishonest man, she thought. He was a man who had learned to want things and to pursue them with efficiency, which was a different thing. She asked him what he intended to do with the property. He said mixed-use development, that the county was growing in this corridor, that the land had good road frontage when you considered the eventual widening of County Road 7, which the county had been discussing for several years. He said discussing for several years with a slight shift in tone, just enough to suggest that he had access to information about the timeline of that discussion that she did not. She told him she had not made any decisions about the property. He nodded and said that was understandable. He said he was aware there were outstanding county taxes on the property, $411, which would become a lien if they ran another 60 days past due, and that his offer would of course absorb those as part of the transaction. He said of course the way people say it when they want something to sound like common sense rather than leverage. He reached into his coat pocket and set a folded document on the bar beside his card. He said it was a preliminary letter of intent. No obligation, just something for her to look over at her convenience. Then he straightened and looked at her with the steady, moderate expression of a man who had learned to be patient because patience usually worked. Nora did not look at the document. She kept her eyes on him. She said she would think about it. He said he appreciated that, and he meant it, because thinking about it was better than a refusal, and he knew the difference. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the bar and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the room once more, at the shelving and the bottles and the bar. He said it was a well-built place. He said it as though that fact was a point in favor of his offer, which it was, in his accounting. Then he went down the porch steps and got into the sedan and backed out onto the drive without hurrying. Nora stood at the bar until the sound of the car on the gravel faded to nothing. Then she looked down at the letter of intent on the bar top, at his business card beside it. She picked up the ledger, which she had been keeping at the end of the bar near the cash she had not yet moved, and she opened it to the entry she had found 2 days before. Gerald Foss, March of 1991, $18, truck repair. She looked at that entry for a moment. Then she turned to the front of the ledger and went through it page by page, slowly, reading every name, until she found the one she was looking for. It took her 20 minutes. It was in the entries from 1983, a family name that appeared twice. Holt. Once in February, $31 listed as groceries and children's boots. Once in April of the same year, $22 listed as school fees, 2 children. She set the ledger down. She did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to. She picked up the business card and looked at it and set it back down beside the letter of intent, and then walked through to the kitchen and picked up the first garland grate from the stack against the wall and carried it to the utility sink, and turned on the tap and began working at the rust with a wire brush she had bought at Greer's the day before. The water ran orange and then clear. She kept working. Outside, the afternoon was getting thin, the light going amber through the kitchen window, and she worked in it steadily without thinking about much, the wire brush scraping in a slow rhythm against the cast iron, pulling the rust away in fine red threads that circled the drain and disappeared. The beadboard panel on the north wall of the kitchen was 9 feet wide and ran floor to ceiling, painted the same cream color as the rest of the kitchen walls, so many times over the decades that the individual boards had lost their crisp definition at the edges, the paint filling the grooves until the surface had a softness to it, like something that had been worn smooth by a hand passing over it repeatedly. Nora found it on the morning after Holt's visit, following Ruth's instruction from the letter. She knocked along the wall with her knuckle, moving left to right, and heard the change in resonance at the fourth section from the right, a hollow return where the others gave back the flat sound of a wall with framing behind it. She pressed. Nothing moved. She looked at the baseboard and found what she was looking for. A small brass hook recessed into the trim, flush enough to miss if you were not expecting it. She lifted the hook and the panel swung inward on a piano hinge concealed in the right side seam. Behind it was a room perhaps 8 feet by 10, its walls bare stud framing, a single bare bulb on a pull chain in the ceiling that still worked when she pulled it. The floor was poured concrete, dry, with a rubber mat in the center. On the mat sat a gray fireproof lockbox, roughly the size of a carry-on bag, its combination dial centered on the front. Nora crouched and turned the dial to 1, then 2, then 4. The latch released with a clean mechanical click, the kind a well-made lock makes when it has been maintained. She lifted the lid. The $14,000 was banded in packets of 500, each band hand-labeled in Ruth's writing with the amount and a date, the most recent dated 11 months before Ruth had moved to the care facility. The bills were mixed, 10s and 20s and 50s, the kind of accumulation that happens over years of careful setting aside rather than a single deposit. Beneath the money was the original deed to the property, the survey markers described in precise legal language, the parcel encompassing 4.3 acres including the building, the outbuilding, and a strip of creek frontage at the back of the property that Nora had not yet reached. Beneath the deed was a rubber-banded stack of documents, letters, and receipts, and one folded piece of graph paper with a hand-drawn site map of the property showing the well location, the septic field, and the buried propane line from the tank on the south side to the kitchen range. She carried everything to the bar and set it in order and called Gerald Foss from the payphone at the Iron Wheel that afternoon. She told him what she had found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was not entirely surprised that Ruth had told him there were provisions beyond what the letter of intent described, but that she had not told him the specifics. He asked if Nora could bring the documents to his office. She said she could come the next morning. He said he would clear the morning. Before she hung up, she told him about Dennis Holt's visit, described the letter of intent still sitting on the bar. Foss was quiet again, a longer quiet this time. He said to bring that too. She drove to Delwood at 8 the next morning and spent 2 hours in Foss's office while he went through the documents with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had handled other people's important papers for 4 decades and understood what carelessness cost. The deed was clean. The survey was recorded. The outstanding tax balance had already been paid, Foss told her, pulling a receipt from a file he had prepared. Paid from a small account Ruth had maintained specifically for property expenses, with enough remaining to cover 2 more years of county assessments. He looked at Holt's letter of intent and set it aside without comment, then looked at it again and said that $61,400 was below assessed value by a meaningful margin, and that she should not feel any urgency about it. When Nora came out of Foss's building at 10:30, there were 2 people on the sidewalk who had not been there when she went in. A man in his late 60s, broad and deliberate in his movements, stood near the bottom of the stairs with his hat in his hands. Beside him, a woman of similar age, her coat buttoned to the throat despite the mild morning. They looked at Nora when she came through the door, and the man said quietly, "Are you the one who has Ruth's place now?" Nora said she was. He said his name was Harlan Combs. He said Ruth had helped his family more than once over the years, and he had heard someone was at the old tavern, and he wanted to say it in person, that he was glad the place had gone to someone Ruth had chosen. He did not say anything else. He put his hat back on and nodded, and the two of them walked back up the street. By the time Nora returned to the tavern that afternoon, there were 3 vehicles parked on the gravel drive: a pickup, a station wagon, and an older sedan, none of them new. On the porch, 4 people stood in a loose cluster, not grouped the way people group when they know each other well, but the way they group when they have arrived separately for the same reason. An older woman with a covered dish, a man with a box of basic carpentry supplies, a hammer and a paper bag of nails and a box of 2-inch wood screws, the kind of thing you bring when you want to be useful and do not want to presume. A younger man, maybe 30, who introduced himself as Clifton Pruitt and said only that he had grown up down the road and had heard the news. A teenage girl with him, who did not give her name but helped carry things without being asked. They came in and stood in the main room and looked at it the way people look at a place they have heard about but never entered. Nora showed them the bar, the ledger still sitting at the end of it. She did not explain the ledger. She did not need to. The woman with the covered dish, whose name was Loretta Sizemore, read 3 or 4 entries near the middle of the book and then closed it gently and set her hand flat on the cover and stood that way for a moment. The man with the carpentry supplies asked if there was a list of what needed doing, and Nora said she was just beginning to put one together. He said he could come back Saturday with more hands if she wanted. She said she would be here. Dennis Holt came back on a Friday, 4 days later. He parked in the same spot, came up the porch steps with the same measured pace. But the porch steps had been re-nailed since his last visit, and the collapsed section of the porch roof had been shored with a temporary post and header, rough but solid. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, which now had its tables back on the floor, chairs down, the bar surface cleared and wiped. Nora stood behind the bar. 3 other people were in the room, 2 of the men from Saturday's work still finishing a section of floor repair near the stove, and Loretta Sizemore at the far end, refilling the salt cellars from a box she had brought. Holt looked at all of this and then looked at Nora. She slid his letter of intent across the bar to him. She said she would not be selling. He looked at the letter, then at the room again, then at her. He picked up the letter and folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. He said he understood. He said it without detectable bitterness, which was the best thing about him, and he went back down the newly solid porch steps and got into his car and did not come back. The work took 6 weeks. Not the work of restoring the tavern to what it had been, which would have taken longer and was not precisely the goal, but the work of making it sound and clean and usable, which was a different project with a more achievable end. Clifton Pruitt came back the Saturday after he said he would, and he brought his younger brother and a man named Dale Tackett, whose family name Nora had seen in the ledger, the February 2003 entry, heating oil during a cold snap. Dale was a Finnish carpenter by trade, and he went through the building with a practiced eye and made a list on a folded piece of paper that he left on the bar. And the list was long, but it was not discouraging, which was how a good carpenter delivers a list. The floor behind the bar was relaid properly, the lifted section fitted back with new fasteners, the boards persuaded flat with a pipe clamp and allowed to dry under weight before they were nailed. Dale sistered a rafter in the main room, where the span had developed a slight bow over the decades, a 2x6 sistered to the original timber, with lag screws driven at offset angles, clean, solid work that would outlast everyone in the room. The porch roof was rebuilt from the collapsed section outward, new rafters on the original bearing plate, decked with 1/2-inch plywood and covered with roll roofing that Dale said would hold 10 years minimum. The soft section of the exterior wall near grade was cut out and replaced with pressure-treated lumber and flashed at the base with aluminum, which was how it should have been done the first time. Nora worked alongside them every day, learning when she did not know and not pretending otherwise. She learned to drive a lag screw without stripping the head by keeping the driver square and easing off before the seat. She learned the difference between a stud finder reading and a hollow wall sound. And she learned it in the way that sticks, which is by making the mistake once and having it corrected without comment by a man who has made the same mistake himself. She paid for materials, and Dale and Clifton would not take wages, which she argued about for a week before she understood that the argument was one she was going to lose and stopped making it. She moved out of the Cavalier and into the back room of the Tavern, the one Ruth had lived in, which was small and had a wood stove and a narrow bed with an iron frame and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. The garden had gone to grass and dockweed, but the soil beneath, when she turned a square of it with a spade she found in the outbuilding, was dark and friable, the kind of soil that has been fed and tended for years and remembers it. She did not plant anything yet. It was too late in the season, but she turned the square and looked at the soil and put that on the list of things for spring. She reopened the Tavern on a Saturday morning in late November, which was not a grand reopening in any formal sense, there being no sign and no announcement beyond word passed between the people who had already been helping and the people they mentioned it to. She unlocked the front door at 8 in the morning and left it open and put coffee on the Garland range, which ran clean after Dale had replaced the thermocouple and bled the propane line. By 9 o'clock there were 7 people at the tables. By 10 there were 11. Loretta Sizemore brought a pan of cornbread and set it on the bar without asking, and it was gone in 20 minutes. Nora stood behind the bar and made coffee, and listened to the room fill up with conversation, which was a sound the building had been waiting a long time to hold again. She put the ledger behind the bar, not on display, not hidden. Just there, in the space under the counter where a working bar keeps the things it uses constantly. She did not tell people it was there. But Harlan Combs came in one afternoon in the second week and stood at the bar and asked quietly if he could look at it, and she set it in front of him, and he turned through the pages slowly with both hands on the cover and read without speaking, and then closed it and pushed it back across the bar and thanked her, and went to sit at one of the tables with a cup of coffee, and was still there an hour later, not talking to anyone, just sitting in the room. The ledger became a thing people knew about without it being discussed in any way she could point to. It was county knowledge, the kind that moves through a community the way water moves through limestone, invisibly and without announcement. A woman came in one Tuesday and told Nora that her mother's name was in there, from 1989, and asked if she could read just the entry. And Nora opened to the page and set it in front of her, and stepped to the other end of the bar to give her the privacy of it. The woman read it and closed the ledger and said thank you and ordered coffee and sat for an hour. And when she left, she set a $20 bill on the counter and was gone before Nora could bring change. In the third week of December, Nora added a new entry to the ledger. She used a blue pen, the closest she could find to the color Ruth had used in the later years, and she wrote the date and then sat for a moment before she wrote anything else. She thought about what Ruth put in the description column, how she named the thing plainly without explanation or sentiment. Nora wrote, Clifton Pruitt, Dale Tackett, Harlan Combs, Loretta Sizemore, and others. 6 weeks of labor and materials. She counted the weeks and the faces and wrote the number. 41 hours of skilled carpentry, roof and floor and wall. She wrote what she had paid in materials, $638, and in the repayment column she wrote what Ruth had always written, the same 4 words in the same plain style. No repayment expected. On a Friday morning in January, she was behind the bar, setting out cups before the first people arrived, when she heard boots on the porch steps. A slow and uncertain sound, not the stride of someone who knows where they are going. A young man came through the door, perhaps 19 or 20, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular stillness of someone who has been outside long enough to have stopped expecting shelter. He stood in the doorway the way Nora had once stood in doorways, taking the room in before he committed himself to being in it. He looked at the bar, and at the cups, and at the warmth of the room, and did not say anything. Nora reached under the bar and brought out a broom, the one she kept there since she had swept out the last of the dust on the first day of real work, and she set it on the counter in front of him. She said the floor could use a sweep if he wanted something to do. He looked at the broom and then at her. He picked it up without asking any of the questions that were clearly behind his eyes, and he started at the far end of the room and worked his way toward the bar in slow, even strokes. Nora turned back to the coffee and listened to the broom moving across the old pine floor. The same floor that had been here for 70 years. The same floor that sounded hollow in one particular place if you knew where to step. Outside, the January light was coming level through the back window, catching the white curtain with its small blue check, the one that had been clean all along. The room smelled of coffee and old wood. It was enough.